What is the best game you've ever played? Was it made by a small indie studio or some massive giant? Was the developer someone you've trusted for a long time? And what game of theirs had you sold? For me, and for many of you out there, I'm sure the best game that I've ever played was The Witcher 3. Or at least that's what I'd been telling people for years. Every part of the game had me hooked. From the world building and characters, the art and environments, down to the combat and my borderline problematic obsession with Gwent. So it came as no surprise that I truly learned to trust CD Projekt Red, and like many of you, when Cyberpunk was announced all the way back in 2012, I was beyond hyped. One thing I really loved about CD Projekt Red is they didn't rush projects out, or at least not to begin with. They really took their time to make sure the game was awesome before people got their hands on it. But then the Cyberpunk release was pushed back, which was totally fine. I wanted the game to be good. And then it was pushed back again and again. Years had passed at this point and people were beginning to get restless. What was taking so long? Then the next gen consoles dropped and it got pushed back again for the next gen release, and people were ready to riot if the game didn't deliver. And that's just what happened. And after 8 full years of development, it finally released, and what an absolute show it was. Now, I never played it at launch because I was so busy at the time, and I'm glad that I didn't. For many people on the older consoles and even on the next gen and PC, the game was so unbelievably unplayable, unhinged, and full of game-breaking bugs that ruined the experience for all, and CD Projekt Red's street cred really tanked, and understandably so. But 4 years have passed since then. 8 major patches, many minor, and the Phantom Liberty DLC have since been released. You might have clicked this video because the game is now on sale and you're wondering if you should pick it up. So, in 2024, is Cyberpunk 2077 worth playing? Long story short, hell yes it is. My name is BigWynter, and let's dive into the specifics of what makes Night City tick, and after this, you'll be able to answer that question yourself. So first off, let me give you a brief overview of the game, avoiding major spoilers, before I break it down into its main categories of graphics, visuals, and performance, combat and mechanics, and finally, the story and the world building. And bonus here, I'm going to be throwing in some details of the Phantom Liberty DLC too. During Cyberpunk, you will play as V, who comes from one of 3 backgrounds: Nomad, Street Kid, and Corpo. Depending on which you choose, it will alter certain dialogue options as well as specific quest lines, but doesn't change the main storyline per se. The map is pretty huge, but for the most part, the game is set within the cyberpunk metropolis of Night City. At the start of the game, you take a job that doesn't go according to plan, and you're thrust into this life or death storyline, clawing your way to a better life. Along this path, you will make many allies and meet many foes. Which is which depends entirely on your choices throughout the game, and how you navigate your playthrough will depend on your playstyle, but you'll have many cybernetic enhancements as well as futuristic weapons and abilities at your disposal. But I'll leave it at that for the overview, as I want to save the details for each of their segments, the first of which is graphics, visuals, and the performance. Now, I'm not going to beat around the bush here, but honestly, this might be one of the best looking games that I think that I have ever played. I remember when I played The Witcher 3 all the way back in 2015, there were so many instances where I just put down my mouse and keyboard so that I could take in the scenery. The Witcher had such a wide range of environments which were largely naturally beautiful. But in Cyberpunk, the scenery was the exact opposite. And by that, I don't mean it looked terrible, it looked amazing, but was obviously a largely synthetic aesthetic. In all honesty, I'm a bit of a sucker for the futuristic cyberpunk aesthetic, and if you liked the art style in the anime, Cyberpunk Edgerunners, or you liked Altered Carbon, you will absolutely love the visuals in Cyberpunk. Even playing on the vanilla game without any mod enhancements, the sheer quality of details in the environment kinda blew my mind. Textures were so crisp, and the sheer quantity of high quality things to look at was insane. The metropolis itself is so vast, both in radius, but also the scale of the buildings in terms of height added so much to the immersive feel of the cityscape. Outside of the city, there was this really interesting mix of high tech, but also slightly poorly managed structures sprawling through this vast desertscape, which was such a cool contrast to the vibrant colors of the city. The character, weapon, and vehicle models were also outstandingly good, which just further immersed me, especially when talking to the NPC characters. Furthermore, a slightly niche point here, but as the game is so large, I streamed much of it on my fairly beefy PC, but some of my playthrough was done offline on the Steam Deck. On my PC, even when streaming, I maintained frames pretty damn well, with a few drops here and there when there were some crazy things going on within the city, but for the most part, I was genuinely really impressed. I know the game ran extremely poorly around launch, but with various updates to the game, it's so much better now, and from my research, this even seems to be the case on on some of the older console hardware. But what surprised me even more was on the Steam Deck. The game ran incredibly well. I was able to play the game pretty flawlessly, even within the dense areas of the city, at a stable 40 plus FPS, which doesn't sound like a lot, but on the Steam Deck's resolution, refresh rate, and screen size, it actually looks crazy smooth. So to summarize and rate this section, I honestly think I would give this game a 9.5 out of 10 for graphics, visuals, and performance, as at least in my playthrough, it was as close to perfect as I could have asked for. But it's about time we move on to section number 2 and take a look at Cyberpunk's combat and mechanics. First up, let me give you a brief overview of what this entails before I talk more on each specific point. Cyberpunk has one of the most diverse systems of gameplay I think I've ever had the pleasure of playing around with. Depending on your preferences, you have such a varied arsenal of weapons, skills, and abilities at your disposal, not just in terms of fighting enemies, but I'm talking about things like hacking, stealth, parkour, firearms, melee combat, and dialogue options. If you've ever watched the Edge Runners anime on Netflix, you'll probably know a fair bit about this already, but many of your abilities in the game come from the skill point allocation within your skill tree, as well as your cyberware enhancements, because living in the future, that's just something you can do. The skill tree is broken down into 5 main categories, with an extra category coming from the DLC, and these are body, cool, intelligence, tech, and reflex, with relic being the DLC tree. Each category will have a ton of abilities that help in various gameplay styles, like body for strength, cool for ninja type stuff, intelligence to be a net runner, tech for various hacking and weapon builds, etc, etc. Unfortunately, you can't max out every skill tree at the same time, but even without this, by the end of the game with all your hard work, you're pretty much a god in any build that you go for. If you're worried about which build to decide on, don't worry, it is possible to respec completely once for free, but more than this, and you would need a mod to do so. Beyond the skill tree I mentioned earlier, you have your cyberware, and if you've watched Edge Runners, these would be things like the Sandovistan that allows you to move super fast and essentially slow down time. You'll have various cyberware slots for your eyes, brain, arms, nervous system, etc. that allow you to customize your build as specifically as you want, which sounds kind of overwhelming to begin with, and it is, but trust me, you'll fall into the build and set of abilities that you find the most fun and satisfying pretty quickly. For example, I wanted to be this super fast and visible ninja, parkouring and stealthing through many encounters, so that's the build that I settled on. But if you want to hack through the back door and make people's cyberware explode in their head, you can totally do that too. Or if you wanted to be an absolute unit and just walk through the front door with electrified fists serving shocking knuckle sandwiches, be my guest. But now moving past your actual character traits, let's start looking externally at things like the weapons and the combat. There is such a wide and varied arsenal of weapons in Cyberpunk, I would be genuinely so shocked if there wasn't a weapon that you wouldn't like. If you wanted a cool tech weapon that auto locks for you, you've got that. If you want a katana that sets people on fire, of course, it's there. Or like me, if you wanted to sneak around invisible throwing kunai at your enemies, you best believe you can do this too. Now, if I'm completely honest, I think the weapons themselves are not the game's strongest point, but that's not to say that they're bad by any means. Personally, I really enjoyed all of the melee weapons as well as the throwable weapons, as they felt super satisfying and really fit my build. I also really liked using the snipers, pistols, and revolvers, but when it came to using things like assault rifles, they felt a little less fun to use and slightly lacking in terms of oomph, but you might disagree on your playthrough. Like I said though, there are so many different types of weapons with varying levels of rarity and unique ability traits, where some are honestly just completely broken, but they're incredibly fun to use. I find that some games' combat systems either cater specifically to a controller or a mouse and keyboard, but what I found here is that it worked really well on both sets of inputs for mouse and keyboard on my PC and the controller layout on the Steam Deck. One thing I will say though is the driving definitely felt better on controller layout than it did on mouse and keyboard side of things, although I think this is a fairly accepted universal principle at this point. But speaking of driving though, I really enjoyed it and genuinely found myself driving most of the routes for my missions over simply fast traveling, as it was really fun and the environments were just so worth exploring. There are a huge variety of vehicles in the game too, from these hilariously shitty little wagon cars to awesome motorbikes and even off-road vehicles with turrets on top. And the really nice part of the vehicles too was once you purchased one, you could easily just call it in wherever you wanted and it'll just spawn in, sometimes in midair, but that's besides the point. The game also features its own crafting and breakdown system, which I had no complaints about honestly, but again, nothing special here. And as a shameless loot goblin, the looting was also pretty effortless, easy to use, and I rarely found myself lacking in resources even on the hardest difficulty that I played on. But I did find the UI in the menu system to be a little janky and overcomplicated when I was trying to access certain features in a hurry, which did result in me fumbling around fairly often at the start of the game, but you really do get used to it. And in terms of difficulty, you have easy, normal, hard and very hard. I'm a glutton for punishment, so I chose the latter, but honestly never found the game to be overwhelmingly difficult other than at the start of the game where you really don't have a build, skills, or abilities yet. Although what I will say is that this is the type of game where feeling OP doesn't feel cheesy or unfulfilling, as it comes as a direct result of your playthrough, choices, and build, so choose whatever difficulty you feel most comfortable with. There are a couple more mechanical points I have, but they fit really well in the next section that I'll put them in there, but to rate this section of combat and mechanics, I'd have to give it another 9.5 out of 10, as again it was as close to perfect that I could have possibly hoped for after all these years. Now on to our final section before we round things out, let's take a look at the story and the world building. Now I will go into some spoilers here, so feel free to skip ahead to the time on screen if you just want to see my rating for this section, so you have been warned. Although these spoilers are mostly things you find out in the prologue before you're let loose on Night City. So before I dive into the specifics of the story and the world building, let me loosely summarize the storyline to set the groundwork before we go on. As I mentioned earlier, you play as V, who can either be male or female depending on your preference, and comes from one of three main backgrounds in the game: Street Kid, Nomad, and Corpo. Street Kid means you start as a bit of a ruffian who grew up in the back streets of Night City. Corpo means you've lived a life within one of the major corporations within Night City, and Nomad means you are part of this roaming band of travelers outside the noise and color of Night City. Depending on your background, you will basically gain advantage on a number of dialogue choices and options going forward, but they don't change the core aspect of the main storyline itself. Without spoiling too much, within the prologue, you take on a job that doesn't quite go to plan, and as a result of it, you make some enemies in the corpos of Night City, and you gain an unwelcome associate, which you spend much of the rest of the game trying to separate yourself from for V's safety and well-being. Whilst this is a very watered down rendition of the story, the game itself does such an amazing job of telling that story in all its depth and splendor that I'll leave you to explore it. But honestly, within the first 45 minutes of playing the game, I immediately knew that this was going to be a game and story that I was going to fall in love with. The rich history and lore of the book and tabletop experience that the game was based on gave such a solid foundation to build off, and in my opinion, CD Projekt Red did such a good job. Not only was the world an incredibly immersive place to be, but the fluidity of gameplay along with the sheer quantity and quality of side quests on top of the intricate main storyline meant the overall experience was so unbelievably top tier. There were many occasions throughout the game where I would actively go out seeking more side quests for more content, as I didn't want the main storyline of the game to end. Plus, many of them were written so well to be interesting, funny, or just downright enjoyable. There were a few quest lines that got surprisingly deep and left me genuinely questioning larger topics of morality, which I can't say that many games do. The storytelling experience, along with the quality of characters in both visuals and their voice acting performance, got me hooked so incredibly quick. And in true CD Projekt Red fashion, the game also had a variety of romance options and companion quests, which in my opinion only adds to the immersive experience by investing you further into the narrative of the game. Side note, again, if you're not choosing Pan Am, I don't know what you're doing. But moving on, the NPC relationships you build not only facilitate your investment in the story, but also actively change the story in giving you a variety of options to tackle various challenges that come up, as the party you're invested with can come to your aid in times of need. And significantly heavier spoilers here talking about my playthrough, so skip ahead if you don't want to hear, but the Johnny aspect of the game and your relationship that you develop depending on your actions and dialogue choices only further differentiates one player's playthrough from another, and I find that so fascinating. I found the way that CDPR tackled having a second soul so fascinating, and the way you really start to care for Johnny, or at least that I did in my playthrough after such a rocky beginning, is not a storyline I'll forget in a hurry. And when it all boils down to the final mission, your choices throughout your playthrough play such a massive role on one of the many endings that you can get in the game. And whilst I really loved the Pan Am ending that I went with because I'm a sucker for a love story, it was clear that there were choices that I could have made differently, and I'm so interested to see what they could have possibly been. And honestly, I'm not the kind of guy to play a story game more than once, and I don't think I've ever started a New Game Plus playthrough in my gaming history, but this game, you best believe I'll be diving back in once I emotionally recover. And just a small side note here, because I honestly forgot to mention it earlier, but the soundtrack to the game is so unbelievably good. It sets the vibe of the futuristic cityscape so unbelievably well, and you can play it on the radio in the cars in the game, which is just awesome. And jumping back again slightly here before I give my final ratings, some more light spoilers in terms of the DLC, so skip ahead once more if you need to, but it was much more of the same, which in my opinion is some seriously high praise. The amazing world design, characters, and storytelling that I fell in love with in the main game continued into the DLC with some added spy thriller spice. The new area of the map wasn't exactly huge, but it was densely packed with great quests and new mechanics that bled out back into the main game too. Plus, Idris Elba, I mean, come on. Jokes aside though, if you're considering not getting the DLC in a bundle with the game, game, I think you'd be making a pretty big mistake. Playing through the DLC during your main game playthrough leads to an even better experience in my opinion. The carrot on the stick you're presented with in terms of the DLC makes for such a fascinating moral dilemma and causes you to make some seriously tough choices, but damn was it good. So to summarize this section of world building and storytelling, I actually think I might give it a 10. And adding up our sections, that brings my total rating as a whole to 9.5, which is as close to perfection as I've seen in a very long time. The Ultimate Edition is currently £69 on Steam, or $44 on the PlayStation Store, or $65 on Xbox, which includes the Phantom Liberty DLC, which I know is not cheap, but to be honest with you, I actually think it's still really good value for money and worth it. You could easily bank up over 100 hours of playtime in your playthrough if you really wanted to take your time. But if you do see it on sale, you should 100% pick it up, as it would be an absolute steal for the sheer amount of fun you could have. If you do decide to pick up the game or you have played before, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, drop a like and sub and ding that bell for the next video, or come join me on twitch.tv/BigWynter sometime. But until then, take care, happy gaming, and much love.